When soldiers become criminals, they don't just break the law, they rewrite it in blood. In the scorched lands of Veracruz, Mexico, where the sun bakes the earth and opportunity dies, young Raúl Hernández Barrón was born in 1974 into a world that offered him two choices: disappear into poverty or fight his way out. His family wasn't wealthy, wasn't connected, wasn't anything special, just another name in a forgotten town where boys grew up fast or didn't grow up at all. But Raúl was different. He didn't dream of wealth or fame. He dreamed of power. Not the kind that comes from money, but the kind that comes from fear. And in Mexico, there was only one institution that offered poor boys a chance at that kind of power: the military. At 17, Raúl Hernández Barrón enlisted in the Mexican army. He wasn't running toward patriotism or honor. He was running toward discipline, weapons, and training. The military took boys from the dirt and turned them into machines. They taught him how to kill, how to strategize, how to operate in the shadows. They gave him structure in a structureless world, purpose in a purposeless life. But the Mexican army in the 1990s wasn't fighting for the people. It was fighting for survival. Corruption bled through every rank, every operation, every order. Soldiers watched politicians get rich while they risked their lives for pennies. They watched cartel bosses drive bulletproof SUVs while they walked patrol in worn-out boots. And slowly, quietly, a question began to form in the minds of men like Raúl Hernández Barrón. Why are we fighting them when we could be them? The military didn't just train him to fight cartels. It trained him to become one. In the mid-1990s, the Mexican government realized they were losing the war on stuff. Cartels were getting stronger, bolder, deadlier. Traditional soldiers couldn't keep up. So they created something new, something brutal, something designed to match the cartel's violence with even greater violence. Grupo Aeromóvil de Fuerzas Especiales, JEFE, the Airborne Special Forces Group. These weren't regular soldiers. These were Mexico's answer to the Navy SEALs, trained in counterinsurgency, urban warfare, interrogation techniques, and psychological operations. They learned how to rappel from helicopters, breach fortified compounds, extract targets in hostile territory. They were taught by American and Israeli military advisors, trained in the most advanced combat techniques in the world. Raúl Hernández Barrón was among them. He excelled. While others struggled with the brutality of the training, Raúl thrived. He understood that violence wasn't just physical, it was psychological. It wasn't about how many bullets you fired, but where you fired them and why. He learned that terror was a weapon, that fear could control entire cities without a single shot. GAFE soldiers were supposed to be Mexico's heroes, the ones who would finally bring down the cartels. But the government made one catastrophic mistake. They trained killers and paid them like janitors. A GAFE operative earned maybe $600 a month. Meanwhile, cartel bosses were making millions. The math was simple, brutal, inevitable. One by one, GAFE soldiers began to disappear. Not killed, not captured, recruited. The Gulf Cartel, led by Ociel Cardenas Guillen, saw the opportunity. Why fight elite soldiers when you could buy them? And Raúl Hernández Barrón, along with approximately 30 other GAFE operatives, made a choice that would reshape Mexico forever. They deserted. Not for money alone, but for respect, for power, for the chance to stop being tools and become architects. In 1999, Ociel Cardenas Guillen, the ruthless leader of the Gulf Cartel, made a deal that would haunt Mexico for decades. He offered the deserting GAFE soldiers something the government never could: wealth, autonomy, and the freedom to operate without rules. In exchange, they would become his personal enforcers, his private army, his executioners. They called themselves Los Zetas, named after the radio code Z used by high-ranking military officials. It was a mockery, a middle finger to the institution that trained them and abandoned them. Among the founding members was Raúl Hernández Barrón, a quiet strategist with a mind for operations and a stomach for violence. But Los Zetas weren't just another cartel enforcement wing. They were different. Fundamentally, terrifyingly different. Traditional cartels operated like businesses, smuggling stuff, bribing officials, avoiding unnecessary violence. Los Zetas operated like an occupying military force. They didn't just move powder and dope, they controlled territory. They didn't bribe politicians, they owned them. They didn't avoid violence, they weaponized it. Raúl Hernández Barrón understood something other cartel members didn't. In Mexico's lawless territories, whoever controlled fear controlled everything. And fear wasn't just about killing. It was about how you killed, when you killed, and who saw it. Los Zetas didn't just murder rivals. They staged massacres. They didn't just intimidate witnesses. They made examples so horrific that people would rather die than testify. They pioneered new methods of terror. Public beheadings, mass graves, torture videos sent to journalists, bodies hung from bridges with messages carved into flesh. This wasn't crime. This was warfare. And Raúl Hernández Barrón was one of its architects. By 2003, Los Zetas had evolved from enforcers into something far more dangerous, an autonomous paramilitary organization. They weren't just working for the Gulf Cartel anymore. They were building their own empire. Raúl Hernández Barrón specialized in recruitment and training. He understood that to build an army, you needed more than guns. You needed loyalty, discipline, and ideology. So he did what the military had done to him. He took broken boys from forgotten towns and turned them into weapons. But unlike the military, Los Zetas offered something real: money, respect, and belonging. In towns where there were no jobs, no future, no hope, Los Zetas became the only option. They recruited teenagers, ex-cops, ex-military, anyone willing to kill for a paycheck. And Raúl trained them, using the same techniques Gafe had used on him. They learned close-quarters combat, ambush tactics, counter-surveillance, and interrogation. But they also learned something darker: how to terrorize entire populations into submission. How to use violence not just as a tool, but as a language. Los Zetas established training camps deep in rural Mexico, far from government eyes. They built infrastructure, safe houses, supply routes, communication networks. They recruited halcones, lookouts, in every neighborhood, paying children and old women to report police movements. They infiltrated police departments, military units, government offices. They didn't just operate in the shadows. They were the shadows. And Raúl Hernández Barrón was one of the key figures ensuring the machine ran smoothly. Los Zetas expanded beyond stuff trafficking. They kidnapped businessmen, extorted shop owners, stole oil from pipelines, smuggled weapons, trafficked humans. They weren't a cartel anymore. They were a state within the state, a parallel government funded by blood and terror. In Tamaulipas, Nuevo León, Veracruz, and beyond, Los Zetas became the law. They controlled who lived, who died, who spoke, who stayed silent. Entire towns lived under their shadow, where mayors answered to Zetas commanders and police worked as Zetas informants. The Mexican government tried to fight back. But how do you fight an enemy that looks like you, thinks like you, and was trained by you? Power is a poison. The more you have, the more you want. And by 2010, Los Zetas had grown too powerful, too ambitious, too hungry. For years, they had operated as the armed wing of the Gulf Cartel. But they were no longer satisfied being enforcers. They wanted control. They wanted the stuff routes, the profits, the territory. And the Gulf Cartel wasn't willing to share. The split was inevitable, brutal, and catastrophic. In 2010, Los Zetas formally broke away from the Gulf Cartel, declaring themselves an independent organization. The Gulf Cartel retaliated, and what followed was one of the bloodiest conflicts in Mexican history. Former allies became mortal enemies, cities became battlegrounds, civilians became collateral. Raúl Hernández Barrón, now a senior commander, found himself in the middle of a war that would consume thousands of lives. This wasn't just about territory anymore. It was about survival. And in that war, there were no rules, no mercy, no limits. Los Zetas fought the Gulf Cartel, the Sinaloa Cartel, the Mexican military, and rival Zetas factions all at once. They unleashed a level of violence Mexico had never seen. In 2011, they massacred 72 migrants in Tamaulipas, leaving their bodies piled in a warehouse as a message. In 2012, they killed 49 people and dumped their dismembered bodies on a highway. This wasn't strategy anymore. This was rage. This was chaos. And Raúl Hernández Barrón was part of the machinery grinding Mexico into dust. But power built on fear is fragile. Loyalty bought with money is temporary. and Los Zetas, for all their strength, were beginning to fracture from within. Internal betrayals, leadership struggles, and relentless government pressure began to tear the organization apart. High-ranking commanders were arrested or killed. Cells went rogue. The empire Raúl had helped build was collapsing, and everyone inside knew it. The question wasn't if it would fall, it was when and who would be left standing when it did. By 2013, Los Zetas were no longer Mexico's most feared cartel. They were its most hunted. The Mexican government, pressured by the United States and desperate to show results, launched massive operations targeting Zetas' leadership. One by one, the founders fell. Heriberto Lascano, El Lasca, the original leader, was killed in a firefight in 2012. Miguel Treviño Morales, Z40, one of the most brutal commanders, was captured in 2013. Others were arrested, murdered by rivals, or betrayed by their own men. And Raúl Hernández Barrón, the quiet architect, the strategist, the man who had trained an army of killers, he became a target. Unlike the flashy leaders who craved fame and fear, Raúl had always operated in the shadows. He didn't give interviews, didn't flaunt wealth, didn't seek attention. He understood that in the world of organized crime, the loudest voice is the first to be silenced. But shadows don't last forever. In 2014, Mexican authorities closed in on Raúl Hernández Barrón. Intelligence reports, informants, surveillance, all the tools he had once used against others were now being used against him. The government wanted to make an example, to show the world that Los Zetas' reign was over. When they found him, he didn't go down in a blaze of glory. No dramatic shootout, no Hollywood ending. He was arrested quietly, efficiently, the same way he had operated his entire life. Raúl Hernández Barrón, one of the founding members of Los Zetas, one of the architects of Mexico's nightmare, was locked away in a maximum security prison. The man who had trained armies, orchestrated massacres, and built an empire of fear was reduced to a number in a cell. But his story didn't end with his arrest. Because Los Zetas weren't just an organization. They were a system, a blueprint, a philosophy of violence that had infected Mexico at its core. Today, Raúl Hernández Barrón sits in prison, forgotten by the world, erased from headlines, invisible in the way he always preferred. But his legacy is everywhere. Los Zetas didn't just change how cartels operated, they changed Mexico itself. Before Los Zetas, cartels were criminal enterprises. After Los Zetas, they became terrorist organizations. They proved that military training, when combined with ruthlessness, could conquer entire regions. They showed that terror, systematically applied, was more powerful than money. They demonstrated that in a country where the government was weak, corrupt, and divided, a well-organized paramilitary force could become the de facto ruler. And other cartels learned. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG, which rose to power in the 2010s, adopted the Zetas model: military discipline, extreme violence, territorial control, and sophisticated operations. They recruited ex-soldiers, trained operatives, and terrorized populations just like Los Zetas had. The Gulf Cartel, Sinaloa Cartel, and dozens of smaller groups all adapted, all militarized, all became more brutal. Because Los Zetas had shown them the blueprint, and Raúl Hernández Barrón had helped write it. Today, Mexico is more violent than ever. Over 400,000 people have been killed in cartel-related violence since 2006. Tens of thousands have disappeared. Mass graves are discovered regularly. Journalists are murdered. Politicians are assassinated. Entire towns are abandoned. This is the world Los Zetas created. This is the legacy of men like Raúl Hernández Barrón. He didn't invent violence. He didn't invent corruption. But he weaponized them, systematized them, turned them into something that could conquer a nation. To understand Los Zetas, you have to understand the men who built them. And Raúl Hernández Barrón wasn't a psychopath, wasn't insane, wasn't born evil. He was a product of a broken system, born into poverty, abandoned by a government that promised protection but delivered nothing, trained by a military that turned him into a weapon and then discarded him. Raúl made a rational choice in an irrational world. He looked at Mexico and saw a country where laws were suggestions, where justice was a joke, where power came only through violence. And he chose power. That's what makes Los Zetas so terrifying. They weren't anomalies. They were inevitable. In a country where institutions fail, where corruption is systemic, where the state cannot or will not protect its people, groups like Los Zetas will always emerge. Raúl Hernández Barrón didn't destroy Mexico. He just understood it better than most. He saw that in a land where the government was the enemy, the police were criminals, and the law was fiction, the only real power came from being more brutal, more organized, and more ruthless than everyone else. And for a while, it worked. Los Zetas conquered cities, built an empire, and became legends. But empires built on blood always collapse. Because terror is a tool, not a foundation. Fear can control people, but it can't build loyalty. Violence can conquer territory, but it can't create stability. And in the end, Los Zetas became victims of their own success. They grew too large, too brutal, too reckless. They made too many enemies, committed too many atrocities, attracted too much attention. The same violence that built their empire destroyed it. And Raúl Hernández Barrón, who had helped create the monster, watched it devour itself from the inside. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Raúl Hernández Barrón did not create the conditions that made Los Zetas possible. Mexico did. A government that couldn't provide security, couldn't offer opportunity, couldn't protect its people. A military that trained elite soldiers and paid them poverty wages. A society so unequal that joining a cartel was the only path to survival for millions. A system so corrupt that crime and government became indistinguishable. Los Zetas didn't emerge despite Mexico's institutions. They emerged because of them. Raúl Hernández Barrón was a soldier who realized his government had failed him. So he stopped fighting for it and started fighting for himself. He took the training, the discipline, the tactics the state gave him, and used them to build something the state couldn't stop. Does that make him a monster? Or does it make him a mirror, reflecting the ugliness of a system that created him? The answer is both. He made choices, brutal, horrific choices. He trained killers, orchestrated violence, built an organization responsible for tens of thousands of deaths. He isn't a victim. He's a perpetrator, a criminal, a murderer. But he's also a symptom of something larger, something deeper, something that won't disappear even with him locked away. Because the conditions that created Los Zetas still exist. The poverty, the corruption, the institutional failure, all of it remains. And as long as it does, there will always be another Raúl Hernández Barrón, another group of soldiers looking for a better deal, another organization willing to rule through terror. Los Zetas weren't an aberration. They were an evolution, and Mexico is still evolving. Today, Raúl Hernández Barrón remains locked in a Mexican maximum security prison, his name largely forgotten by the world. No journalists interview him, no documentaries feature him, no books tell his story. He's been erased intentionally because governments don't want to acknowledge men like him. They don't want to admit that their own soldiers, their own elite forces, became the most dangerous criminals in the country's history. But erasure doesn't mean he's gone. In prisons across Mexico, former Zetas operatives still operate. In training camps hidden in the mountains, new recruits still learn the tactics Raúl once taught. In mass graves and unmarked tombs, his legacy still bleeds into the earth. He built something that outlasted him. A system, a philosophy, a blueprint for conquest through terror. And somewhere in his cell, in the silence of confinement, Raúl Hernández Barrón sits with the knowledge that he succeeded. He escaped poverty, gained power, built an empire, and even though it collapsed, even though he's locked away, his creation endures. Los Zetas may have fractured, but their DNA infects every major cartel in Mexico. Their methods are copied, their tactics studied, their brutality emulated. Raúl Hernández Barrón isn't just a man anymore. He's an idea, and ideas are harder to kill than men. There will be no trial for the soul of Los Zetas, no reckoning for the thousands who died at their hands, no justice for the families who lost sons, daughters, fathers, mothers to an organization that treated human life like currency. Because justice requires a functioning system, and Mexico's system is broken. Raúl Hernández Barrón will sit in prison until he dies, or until someone kills him. But the machine he helped build keeps running. The violence continues. the terror persists. And the next generation of soldiers, looking at the same poverty and corruption that shaped Raúl, will make the same calculations he did. They'll see that the system offers them nothing. They'll see that crime offers them everything, and they'll choose accordingly. This is the cycle. This is the curse. And until Mexico fixes the rot at its core, the corruption, the inequality, the institutional failure, it will keep producing men like Raúl Hernández Barrón, men who were trained to protect and chose to destroy, men who saw their country and decided it was easier to conquer than to save. Men who built empires from fear and left graveyards in their wake. Some men are born monsters, others are trained to be, but a few are both. Raúl Hernández Barrón didn't just betray his country, he became its darkest mirror. And in that reflection, Mexico saw what it truly was.